I know how busy you are, and I appreciate you taking the time to be part of this. I'm going to pause at 3 points during the presentation to take a few questions, and then at the end, hopefully have some time for questions as well. This is a big picture talk in which I'm going to give you an overview of some of the interesting research that we're doing about different forms of immersion and how that can aid with education. So, I never like to start with the technology because starting with the technology is a solution looking for a problem. We all know that there are challenges in classroom settings, whether those are pre-college or higher education, that are just perennial. They've been around forever. And they stem from the fact that classrooms are barren places. Students, not surprisingly, are bored, especially because recent advances in information technology have made the rest of their lives incredibly rich outside of classrooms. Teachers are struggling because with the financial woes that the world is experiencing, they have less and less in terms of resources, and yet they're asked to personalize instruction to increasingly large groups of students. And even when teachers are teaching really well, the kinds of assessments that we're using don't measure the deep knowledge, the sophisticated skills, the 21st century skills that our students need. So it's a discouraging picture. And in my work in learning technologies, I try to center on ways that aid with these and other types of challenges. One of the things that can help classrooms with rich learning rather than being barren is what's known as situated learning. Now, part of my contract with Harvard is I have to use a certain number of polysyllabic words in every presentation. This slide is helping me reach my quota, but if you look beneath the jargon, something like a medical internship is a good example of situated learning. You graduate from med school, you've got high grades, you've got high board scores, you show up at your teaching hospital, you think you're really something, and in about 4 hours you realize you're in deep trouble because nothing looks like multiple choice questions on the boards. Nothing looks like the elegant little essays your professors had you write, and people are going to die if you make the wrong choices. Fortunately, the folks in the hospital know that you don't know anything about applied medicine, and so they put you on the periphery of a community that's doing really high-stakes practice, where you're doing pretty simple things. There's not a curriculum, there's not a teacher, and there's not necessarily even a central mentor, but you do have the opportunity to learn by watching, to have a series of apprenticeships, and in a Vygotskian kind of way, take over more and more of the work with experts helping you to complete until you're right at the center of the community in the teaching hospital. That's what situated learning makes possible. We know that it's very powerful in life. It's never been possible in classrooms because classrooms by definition are remote from the world. But now it can be. And it can be through immersion. Now, immersion is the subjective impression that you are somewhere that you're not actually located. And we've all experienced this. You go to the movies, you're watching Harry Potter. After about 5 minutes, you're no longer psychologically feeling as if you're sitting in a movie theater surrounded by strangers with the exit sign over to your right. Instead, you're with Harry at Hogwarts. That is a very weak form of immersion because it's passive. We work and study with much more powerful forms of immersion, and in this talk, I'm going to mention 2 of the 3 that are on the screen. The first, multi-user virtual environments, or MOVEs, is the Alice in Wonderland interface, where you go through the monitor window and become a digital person in a virtual world. The third, ubiquitous computing, is where you walk through the real world, but you're a little like the Terminator. You can see the real world, but you can also, through your eyes, see data or simulation or experience superimposed on top of the real world. We also work in the third area, virtual reality, but I don't really have time to discuss that today. So the way the talk is going to go is I'm going to talk about MOVES' curriculum, and we'll have a chance for you to ask some questions or make some comments. And then MOVES' assessment, and again, that'll be a natural place to break. And then finally, sketch our work in augmented reality and try to put all of it together at the end. So the first project I want to talk about is called EcoMove. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Education. It is a 1-month middle school science curriculum. We're actually in the 4th year of that work under a no-cost extension. And what's interesting about the curriculum is that it uses 2 digital ecosystems that are immersive simulations that can happen inside of a classroom. So we're teaching some things that will be familiar to science educators. We're teaching ecosystem science knowledge. We're teaching science inquiry. In fact, we're teaching team-based science inquiry. But we're also teaching something not so familiar, which is complex causality and systems thinking, which is often not taught pre-college at all in science. So we're studying the extent to which immersion can help us to achieve these teaching goals. There is a pond near Harvard called Black's Nook. We modeled one of our 2 digital ecosystems on that pond, but it is a generic digital ecosystem. It's an aquatic ecosystem, and the postdoc on this project, Dr. Amy Kamarainen, is an ecosystem scientist, so we're very careful about both the authenticity of the scientific processes and the validity of what we're presenting in terms of ecosystems. This is built in a modern gaming engine, and so the visual graphics are excellent. And the first thing that students do when they get inside of the ecosystem is they walk right into the pond and under the water, which of course they can't do on a real field trip because they would drown or at least get very wet. And they can also see things that they wouldn't be able to see if they walked under the water in a real pond. They can see on the first day that they visit in this virtual world that the water is quite clear. On the second day when they come back, it's raining in the virtual world and the water is brown and cloudy. And when they take their measurements, they find out the turbidity is high, so they begin to understand what turbidity is. And then on the third day, even though the sun is shining and it's beautiful again, the water is cloudy still and it's green. And that is a clue that most students don't recognize at the time, but that they realize later is a signal about a complex causal process that can happen. So one of the power aspects of situated learning is we can build a lot of things in that are tacit, that are not directly stated, that students learn to recognize as we teach them to be sophisticated about what they're seeing. Real ecosystem scientists, of course, do lots of kinds of measurements of variables in the environment, and it's easy for us to simulate that inside of the virtual world so that students are measuring these variables, and then like turbidity, they're also seeing how this is reflected in the actual sensory experience. But we also use magic in a very principled way. We don't use magic for entertainment because we feel that the ecosystem itself can be made very engaging and motivating. But we do use magic to help overcome misconceptions that students have even after they visit real ecosystems. One of those misconceptions, non-obvious causes, means that if there are things you can't see, you tend to discount them when you think about what's going on. And so we have a magic submarine that students can get into, and it shrinks them down to a 10th or a 100th or a 500th of their normal size. And then when they dive in the submarine into the pond, they can see all sorts of things through the porthole that they cannot see at the macroscopic level. And seeing these different kinds of microscopic phenomena helps them understand all the different things that are taking place in this pond dynamics. It also gives them a healthy respect for why not to drink pond water. Another thing that students find confusing about ecosystems is the flow of matter through the ecosystem. So as a second form of magic, we have an atom tracker in which it's as if individual atoms have GIS systems inside of them, and you can adopt an atom, like a carbon atom or an oxygen atom or a phosphorus atom. And it's a little like Where's Waldo? Every time you go to the ecosystem, your atom's in a different place. It's in the stomach of a duck, and then it's pooped onto the floor of the pond, and then it's up in the air in a carbon dioxide molecule, and then it's, inside of a plant because it's gone through the process of photosynthesis. It really helps students to understand the flow of matter. So what we're using is a kind of tension between authentic experience that's just like the real world and simulations and magic that take advantage of the power of the virtual world. Another thing we know about these virtual experiences is that story is important. And so there is a story in our pond ecosystem about 2/3 of the way through the simulated 6-week period of the pond. All the large fish in the pond die overnight. And the students are then asked to figure out what killed the fish. And they can go backward and forward in time to these different days on the pond, and they work in teams of 4, where each team member has a different role in the data they collect, and the team has to combine their knowledge in order to solve what's going on. So it's a jigsaw pedagogy that helps students understand how team-based inquiry works. And they find that the causal events that lead to the fish dying actually start the very first day that they're at the pond. If they wander up the hill to a housing development that's part of the watershed, and they find Manny, who is fertilizing the lawns because the developer wants to sell the houses and the lawns look kind of ratty. And this leads to a very complex causal chain. So what we're studying is, how successful are we in teaching ecosystem science? How successful are we in teaching collaborative inquiry? How successful are we in helping students on their own, working together, figure out this very complex systemic process that they're seeing? And then, is this helping them to be more engaged? Do they feel as if they're more interested in science? Do they feel as if they might want to become involved in STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics of some point? Now, our goal in doing this is broader than simply developing a really nice ecosystem science curriculum for the middle school and showing that immersive interfaces can be used to tackle some of these problems with classrooms being barren. Our goal is to show that this type of immersive authentic simulation can be used very broadly across the curriculum for many different kinds of subjects, because you have the kind of affordances, the kind of features that are listed on this slide, which are not just important in science, but are important in many types of teaching. So we can imagine learning economics in a simulated mall, or learning history in a simulated cemetery. There's all sorts of interesting possibilities here. We also know that our students are learning new literacies at the same time that they're engaged in this immersive experience. And literacy is a very strong term. It implies that something is fundamental in the way that we know reading or writing or mathematics is fundamental. But it appears in the 21st century that many of these literacies are highly important, and this environment provides students the opportunity to gain experience with these sorts of literacies. So the first chunk that I wanted to present is that in terms of curricula, we now can get past many of the problems of barren classrooms and bored students with our ability to simulate authentic situations that are a mixture of the real world and special supports to help students overcome difficult misconceptions and help them learn sophisticated concepts. And that we should all start doing more studies of these kinds of environments across a range of subject areas and a range of developmental levels in order to understand what their strengths and limits are. Now, I'm going to talk next about assessment. So you can hold perhaps your questions about assessment, but I'm delighted at this point to pause and just look at the chat and see what kinds of questions you have that I might answer quickly. One of them is, how does this translate to PISA? PISA is, among the paper and pencil tests, the one that I think gets closest to what students really need in the 21st century, because it asks students to construct knowledge, it asks them to do relatively complex forms of problem solving. It's limited by being paper and pencil, but in fact we believe that this kind of curriculum is going to get our students closer to being able to do well on PISA than more conventional forms of science teaching, even good forms of science teaching where they're doing project-based learning. Any other questions at this point that I can answer that you want to put in terms of the chat? Is EcoMove free? EcoMove is a federally funded research project. We are planning to release the curriculum next June. Whether we release it through a publisher, in which case it wouldn't be free, but Harvard wouldn't really make any money off it, so hopefully the price would be pretty low, or whether we just release it under a free license from Harvard is something that we're figuring out right now. Could you make these virtual environments yourselves easily? Yes and no. You can make a simple virtual environment pretty easily. It is getting easier to make complex virtual environments because greater and greater libraries are building up of digital objects, digital architectures, digital environments that you can use as building blocks. But it still is a complex process to create the environment and to think through the instructional design. Why not release it for free? Well, first, I'm not Harvard, so Harvard is the one that determines the licensing. They're the ones that own the intellectual property. Basically, because if you release it for free, what studies show is it's not widely used. That it's helpful to have a support network, it's helpful to have a distribution network, it's helpful to have a marketing network if you really want to make an impact on the field. So you can argue for free, you can argue for moving it through some kind of vendor. We're sorting out what the best way is to think about that. But in order to finish within the time, let me go on and talk about a second chunk of material. How do we assess whether or not the EcoMove is effective along these different dimensions of both motivational advances that students make and then different kinds of cognitive advances that they make? And this is problematic because, as I said on the first slide, paper and pencil item-based tests, even PISA, really can't effectively measure sophisticated intellectual performances and sophisticated psychosocial skills. Human beings can measure that, but that's not scalable or affordable. So we need a new form of assessment that can complement paper and pencil tests in helping us measure sophisticated things. So in a second project called VPA, Virtual Performance Assessment, we are studying whether this same interface, this Alice in Wonderland interface, can be used now not as a curricular environment for learning, but as an assessment environment for measuring what students know and don't know. And the specific thing that we're trying to measure is inquiry, because inquiry is an important skill. In a generic way, it's a 21st century skill, and science inquiry is certainly at the heart of the science standards. This is a well-understood skill that cognitive scientists have analyzed for about a generation. As you can see from this slide, it has a lot of sub-skills in it. So if we can develop something that can measure this well, it really would be an advance in terms of assessment, because studies have already shown that paper and pencil assessments cannot do a good job of evoking science inquiry in students and then measuring what they know and don't know. So instead of a 1-month curriculum, we're now looking at 90-minute to 2-hour assessments that are not for learning, they're for measuring, but they do use the same interface. So in one of these assessments, students appear on the shores of a bay in Alaska where the kelp forest is depleting, and they're asked to use their inquiry skills to figure out why the kelp is dying. Now, this is not a content test, so we have to be very careful that all students know about the same amount about kelp and oceans and so on, because we're not trying to measure their content knowledge. We want to measure their skill in using assessment in order to figure things out. There's 2 reasons that multi-user virtual environments are very promising for assessment. One of them is that we can evoke a much richer challenge for students using a virtual world than we can putting something on paper. So if we tried to do the eco-move on paper, things like the subtle changes in the water wouldn't be subtle, because either you would describe them, in which case they would be obvious, or you wouldn't describe them, in which case students wouldn't know that they were happening. So part of what these assessments provide is the chance to really mirror the real world situation that we're trying to prepare students for and evoke the skills that we really want them to have. But the other thing that makes this powerful is what's known as audit trails. So everything that lives on a server, all social media, virtual worlds, augmented realities, and so on, has an audit trail, because the server is watching what you do, and every time you do something, it notes that and timestamps it. And in virtual worlds in particular, we get an incredibly rich record for each student of exactly what they're doing inside of something like the eco-move or inside of our assessments. We have, in a sense, the opposite problem that teachers have when they do learning by doing, project-based learning. If you've got a class with 25 or 30 students in it and they're all learning by doing, they're each going to be in a different place. And it's very hard for the teacher to figure out just what each student needs next, because there's too little information to really customize or personalize learning. In contrast, we have the opposite problem. We have too much information. We have enormous amounts of information about exactly what each student is doing every second. And so our challenge is to take this log data and aggregate it, clump it, filter it, interpret it in such a way that a skilled teacher can eventually look at the string of things that a student is doing and say, oh, I see, this is a student who understands observations but not inferences. Or this is a student who is adept at coming up with hypotheses but doesn't know how to set up a controlled experiment, or whatever the pattern would be. So our goal is to create an assessment in which students' actions have meaning, to collect all of this log file data and interpret it, and then also at the end of the assessment to ask students things like, well, what was killing the kelp? And what evidence do you have that supports your conclusion? So we're looking at both products and processes from a very complex measurement system. This is incredibly difficult work, but it's essential, because if we don't improve the assessments that we're using, all these advances in curriculum won't really matter, because nothing is going to be a major part of what's taught unless it's part of the accountability system, unless it's part of the incentive system by which teachers are measured. So I think this assessment work is incredibly important, and we are happy with the early stages of what we're seeing with these virtual performance assessments, but it is a difficult problem and there's a lot of work that remains to be done. Ironically, what we're building is not what we want to be building. So what we're building now is summative assessments that are like high-stakes assessments, the sort of thing that you might give at the end of a year of instruction to say, okay, what do my students now know about inquiry, and what don't they yet know about inquiry? But in the long run, that's not what we want. We don't want summative high-stakes assessments. We want formative assessments that are diagnostic for instruction, assessments interwoven into learning. Because the summative assessments are just snapshots of what students know on a single day, and they happen too late to influence instruction. Whereas if we have a really rich record that's ongoing about a student's learning trajectory, that's much more useful and powerful for the teacher and the student. It's a little like inventory in stores. I'm old enough to remember, unfortunately, when stores used to close for inventory. And you'd go to a store to buy something and you'd see the sign on the door that said, sorry, come back, we're doing inventory, we'll be open in 3 days. You never see those signs anymore because of the barcode reader. Stores know exactly what they have, second by second, other than shoplifting. And in the same way, when we get really good at formative assessment, we'll never need summative assessment or high-stakes tests. But right now, that's pretty far bridge. So we're doing our research with summative assessments as a stepping stone towards this ultimate goal of getting to truly formative assessments. So what are we finding? We're finding in our research that the EcoMove seems to be effective on all the dimensions that we would hope, and we're in the process now of taking a very large amount of data that we have and writing that up in rigorous form and publishing it. And we're finding that the virtual performance assessments are promising, but we still are trying to measure the extent to which they have the kind of properties that paper and pencil assessments have in terms of fairness and reliability and so on that are important for testing. We know that our assessments are going to be more valid, but we want to make sure that they're also fair and reliable. So a second thing that immersion can be used to do is to build off of these audit trails to provide, I think, a much better way in the long run to measure what students know and don't know. Let me pause again at this point for any questions or comments that you have. The program is meant for middle school, but we believe that these immersive authentic simulations and these immersive assessments could be used at every level of education. Yes, portfolios are an important form of assessment, but it's hard to score portfolios in such a way that you really understand, for example, how students in the U.S. are doing with respect to students in other countries. So we're trying to do this not as the only form of assessment, but as one form of assessment. I don't think that we would want to train teachers to look at log files. That's just too hard. We're doing that for research purposes, but teachers don't have the time to look at something like that. Our goal is to automate the process so that eventually, when we understand how teachers interpret log files, we can use the computer to reach conclusions about what students know and don't know and present that to the teacher, and then the teacher can decide, based on their richer knowledge about the student, whether they believe or don't believe what the assessment is telling them. We are in a situation where personalizing instruction is very important. We are going to be teaching in group settings for at least as long as I'm alive. And in those group settings, we want to be able to individualize and customize. And that means that we need assessments of some form that students can learn by doing, and at the same time the teacher can understand exactly what is going on. Just one more response, and then I want to do the third chunk of material to have some time at the end. PARC and Smarter Balance, which are the two large assessment consortia that are working right now. I've had conversations with both about these new forms of alternative assessment. Others in the research community have as well. They are racing the clock to try to get something up by 2014. And unfortunately, what they get up by that time is likely to look pretty much like paper and pencil assessments that are digitized. But the hope is that once we have that infrastructure for online assessment in place, that maybe between 2014 and 2018, we could really begin to do some powerful forms of assessment that were quite different than just digitizing tests. And so researchers like us are working to try to understand the strengths and limits of these new technologies so that by the time the 2014 rolls around, perhaps we can persuade some of the large-scale assessment companies to really take it seriously instead of doing something that's just automating with information technology what we've been doing for a century. So one more chunk of material, and that shifts from this Alice in Wonderland interface inside of classrooms to mobile learning and learning in the real world, and in particular, a form of learning called augmented reality. So I'm very excited about mobile learning, and I remember the first really powerful handheld device for learning, the Little Professor, which came out 35 years ago. One of the tragedies of my life is I now look like the Little Professor, which is very discouraging to me. I never thought I would get this old. But we know that our modern mobile devices, like cell phones, are much more powerful 35 years later across a whole range of dimensions than the Little Professor was. And my friends in the hardware industry tell me that in the next 10 years, we will gain as much power on those dimensions for mobile devices as we did in the last 35. So we have to begin by thinking that in 2021, every student, rich or poor, anywhere in the world, is likely to have some kind of mobile device in their pocket that's the equivalent of today's supercomputers in terms of power. Now, they won't necessarily have that mobile device for learning, but it can be repurposed for learning. And part of that repurposing involves something we see already, which is the ecology of mobile devices is broadening from just different types of cell phones through e-readers, through gaming devices of different kinds, through tablets, netbooks. So that ecology is helping us to understand what kind of mobile device might be helpful for different forms of learning. Now, in particular, what I'm looking at as a researcher with mobile learning is what is new that mobile learning enables that's different than just taking what we can do in classrooms and doing that everywhere in the world, anytime. It's great to be able to learn throughout life, but is there something special beyond that? And what is special beyond that, one of the things at least, is called augmented reality. And it is, as I said earlier, a little like the Terminator. The Terminator can see the world, but can see overlays onto the world. And we're getting to the point now where if you're somewhere that's unfamiliar and you see something that you can't understand, and I can't understand what I'm looking at right now, you can lift up your mobile device, and through augmented reality, the mobile device will superimpose something over the world that helps you to understand what's going on. That is the promise of augmented reality. And what we're studying in a project that I'm going to describe is what the strengths and weaknesses of that might be for learning. So our follow-on project to the EcoMove that I talked about earlier is the EcoMobile project. And I'm going to just show you some still images, but yesterday, the Verizon Foundation has an initiative they call ThinkFinity. ThinkFinity. And ThinkFinity has a speaker series that I'm part of, and the videos of my talks were released yesterday on the Verizon Foundation ThinkFinity website, and one of them is a very nice video about this work. So beyond just this static presentation, you might want to look at that ThinkFinity video. So we have the EcoMove curriculum, but it is digital ecosystems, and it's inside of the classroom. How might we complement that with students in the real world, in real-world ecosystems? And so we're now sending students out into natural ecosystems like ponds, but with mobile devices that are empowered with augmented reality so that students see the real world, but then they look through the camera and they see simulated data, they see visualizations, they see things like the atom tracker with atoms moving throughout the ecosystem. They can meet virtual people who describe things that are happening in the environment that then they have to figure out. And of course, what we're trying to study is where do mobile learning, augmented realities, overlap with virtual environments and things like classrooms? Where do they complement those and add new dimensions to what's going on? And if you blend the two together, do you get a more powerful set of learning outcomes than doing each on their own? Now, one of the interesting things about augmented reality is it's much easier to author than virtual environments. And so while we are now authoring our augmented realities because we know what the full menu is, and with support from Qualcomm, we're able to use some of their specialized technology that's not generally released yet. We're able to do some really sophisticated things. Towards the end of this project, we plan to explore having teachers build their own special ecosystems augmented realities for ecosystems right in their backyard, and then take it one step further and have students build augmented realities. And again, not just for ecosystems, but augmenting their neighborhoods in terms of history or in terms of energy usage, augmenting the mall in terms of economic flow or social dynamics that go on in the mall. There's all sorts of very powerful things that augmented reality suggests that I talk about in that ThinkFinity video. And as Lucy mentioned early on, there are a number of groups that have mobile learning initiatives. COSN has one that Lucy leads, and I co-host for Qualcomm a conference every year. The 2011 Wireless Ed Tech Conference was held last month, and videos and materials from that conference are available on their website. So if you go to Wireless Ed Tech, all one word, wirelessedtech.com, you can access a lot of things from that conference for free that talk about different forms of mobile learning and that help to explain why people like me are not just excited about augmented reality, but we're excited about mobile learning in general. So the ultimate vision that I want to give you is that for millennia, literally for millennia, we have been saying to learn, you have to get away from the world. You have to go with Socrates to a quiet part of the forum. You have to go to the campus and into a classroom on the campus. You have to go to the school and into a classroom at the school to get away from the world so that you have space to interpret and reflect. And we know that that's powerful. But now we have the opportunity to complement that, not to replace it, but to complement that, I think, in a very interesting way, which is that you can be right in the middle of the world, but you have a device with you that knows who you are and how you like to learn, where you are, and what around you has been augmented for learning, and who you like to learn with, and how to reach them. That is a very powerful concept and something that I and others are trying to study to understand what its strengths and limits might be. So rather than pause here and do mobile learning as a chunk, I'm just going to finish up, and then we can take the rest of the time to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. Immersion for learning, I think, is a very important direction that is relatively new, that opens up all sorts of possibilities in school and in life. And many people are beginning to look at this and assess its power. And the whole trick to it is not to just take what we've been doing before and put it into virtual worlds or put it into augmented realities, but to be very creative about design, understanding that these offer a menu of ways of teaching and learning that is much broader than what we've had before and potentially much more powerful than what we've had before. I was one of 15 people on the technical working group for the 2010 National Educational Technology Plan in the United States. That plan is an attempt to imagine what a 21st century learning system might look like from kindergarten through graduate school. It is not a way of adding technology to schools as we know them now and universities as we know them now. I believe that industrial era schools are a poor match as an organization or a structure for education to our 21st century global knowledge-based, innovation-centered economy. And medieval universities, including Harvard, are an even worse match, if you will. So we need a new kind of educational structure, I believe, and the plan is based on that, and it offers a variety of visions about what that might look like. I don't have the time to summarize the plan. I'm hoping to get you interested in going to take a look. I would skip the executive summary, which is just a rather dry bunch of policy recommendations, and I would start with the section on learning. And if you get excited about the section on learning, I would keep reading and go from there. But notice in this graphic from the plan that schools and universities as we know them now are basically about 10 or 11 o'clock on this graphic. And most of the graphic deals with learning that gets outside of place-based, time-based, seat time-based learning. So that's the fundamental concept that I believe differentiates 21st century education from 20th century education. And immersion, I think, is a big part of that, and it's a big part of what the plan talks about. So this is not about technology. You do need technology to do immersion, but this is really about a different way of teaching. This is really about something that's powerful because of pedagogy rather than technology, because of content rather than technology, because of links between school and life rather than technology. And our biggest challenge really is thinking creatively about it. So I want to close with this well-known optical illusion. If you look carefully, you should be able to see an old woman and a young woman. When I give talks like this to vendors in education like publishers, they get excited and they say, wow, you know, we're moving to digital textbooks. And now instead of having just a still image on a paper page, we could have not just a digital image, but we could have a little virtual world. And so after students read and studied in the textbook, they could have a little learning experience in the virtual world. Or we could have an augmented reality, where after they read and studied in the textbook and in the school, students could go out and do their homework and draw on an augmented reality to help them. That's the old person. And we know what that old person can and can't do and how big the mismatch is between that system that's centered on teaching by telling and learning by listening with a little active learning sprinkled on the top. We know what the limits of that are. But what if we look at the same image, but we emphasize different parts of it? Instead of saying the cake is teaching by telling and learning by listening, and the frosting is this sort of active learning, what if the cake is the active learning, and all of the presentational material that we have is the frosting? So now education centers on active forms of learning, engaging with the world, trying to make sense out of complicated things. And when you get stuck, which is going to happen all the time, then you get support from all of these materials that have been developed for presentation, all of these supports and insights and knowledge structures and skills that have been taught presentationally, but now could be used as support just in time to help that learning by doing. That's the young person. Her face is turned away. We don't really understand fully yet how to do that or what the particular challenges of that kind of educational system would be. But I truly believe in the next 10 years, using immersion and other technologies discussed in the National Ed Tech Plan, our biggest challenge is to shift from trying to put technology into industrial-era schools and medieval-era universities, basically putting a jet engine on a stagecoach, and instead to think about reinventing our educational structures and organizations around a more profound knowledge about learning and teaching and around 21st century technologies based on a global knowledge-based innovation economy. So with that, I want to stop preaching. It's kind of ironic that you've had to listen to teaching by telling about learning by doing, but that's sometimes the limits under which we work. And I just want to throw it open for whatever questions or comments you want to make in our remaining time.
Take some questions for Chris by raising your hand, and I'll give you mic privileges so you can actually say your question. The hand is right above is in the participants window right underneath your name, I believe, like this. You click on that if you want to ask a question, and I will pass the mic to you. In the meantime, I have a question for you, Chris. What work are you doing internationally? Do you have partners in your research, or are there other universities around the world who are doing similar things? What are the implications for your work to be reaching people in other parts of the country, or the world, sorry?
Well, I think that this work has vast implications across the world for a couple of reasons. First, mobile learning is certainly something that is going to be very prevalent in developing countries because their whole infrastructure is mobile devices. It's not laptops and workstations and wires, it's mobile devices. And so some very creative ideas about mobile learning are starting to come out of the developing world that we in the developed world can gain much from. A second thing that I think is important internationally is that if we're going to move away from the industrial era school, that's going to happen faster in the developing world, which hasn't yet committed fully to that infrastructure, compared to the developed world, where there are lots of economic and political forces that are going to fight to keep us with that older educational system. So I think that many creative kinds of new models for education are going to come out globally. And because augmented realities are relatively easy to author, at least compared to virtual environments, teachers and students across the world in countries that are developed or developing can augment their realities. And because gaming is becoming so prevalent across the world, that opens up possibilities with virtual environments as well. So I try to track carefully what's happening across the world, and I think it's very exciting that conferences like this are giving us all the chance to talk to one another.
Is it my turn?
Go for it.
Okay, when you speak of augmented reality, I often think of alternate reality, and particularly alternate reality gaming. And I was just wondering what you think of the work of Jane McGonigal and Craig Aldrich in those areas.
So I'm kind of notorious in a way in my attitudes. Lucy, you might want to mute that mic again so that we're not getting an echo. I'm kind of notorious in my attitudes because I have mixed feelings about gaming, even though I build things that often look like games. They're game-like, but they're not games. And the reason I have mixed feelings is twofold. First, we have lots of winners and losers in scoring systems in education without needing any more. And often games in their scoring systems are pretty simplistic compared to the kinds of complex assessment that I'm interested in doing. So there are some games that are really good about this, but there are a lot of games that aren't. The other thing that I have mixed feelings about is that often that community seems to me to say we could turn everything into a game and all of education could be learning from games. Well, first, everything is not a game. There's lots and lots of things that cannot be taught through gaming because they're more complicated than a game can express. And second, there's no one form of pedagogy that's right for everyone. I would be as nervous about a school that only taught things through immersion or through gaming as I would about a school that only taught things through lecture. We need an ecology of different kinds of pedagogies in order to succeed. And I'm nervous sometimes about people that say gaming is the silver bullet for everything, just as I would be nervous about somebody who said immersion is the silver bullet for everything. Other questions, comments?
Privileges, do you have a question? Jim, we've got about 3 minutes for questions. Do you have one?
Your mic is off if you want to ask it. Well, let me try to work off the questions then that I'm seeing scrolling up in the chat window.
Great.
You're right that assessment is absolutely key. When we did the National Ed Tech Plan, on the last day, we sat around looking at ourselves and trying to synthesize what we'd done, and we all said, if we don't get new forms of assessment, the rest of the plan doesn't mean anything. We have to have better ways of assessing in order to move to all of the other kinds of changes that I discussed today. So that's just absolutely crucial, and I'm cautiously optimistic, but it is not, in fact, an easy problem. The flipped classroom and how that fits. I think that the flipped classroom is an interesting idea if you think that you want to do learning that's largely based on presentation. So you use presentation, but you use it outside of the classroom, and then you do your kind of understanding of the presentation and further steps from the presentation inside of the classroom. I think that's a step forward, but it's still, in my mind, the old person. It's still starting with presentational learning and then trying to sprinkle some learning by doing on top of it. So I'm more interested in moving beyond the flipped classroom to learning by doing at the center than a kind of intermediate step in the flipped classroom that still centers largely on passive assimilation. Lucy, why don't you go ahead and wrap up, because we do have just one more minute left and I don't want to compete with the next presentation.
So much, Chris. I really appreciate this. I think this is really important work that you're doing, and I hope that the word gets out to more people about the potential value of assessment. I'm really concerned, as I think some of the people in chat, about things being done too quickly. And we'd rather see things along the lines that you're talking about. So Chris is a member of our Global Education Collaborative, NING, and you could leave a message for him on the comment page there if you'd like to. If you have a follow-up question. I'm sure he's busy, though, so hopefully he can get to that at some point. But we've really enjoyed having you, Chris. This session is recorded and will be archived in about a half an hour after everybody leaves the room. Let me flip to that slide if I can find it. I don't know if it's still here. And it's not here. Anyway, so it will be archived on the Quick Links page, and you can review everything from here at your leisure and pass it on to colleagues. If you want to save the chat conversation too, by the way, you can go to File and Save Chat, and then you can save all the text with the links that we've talked about during this presentation. So I'm going to close out right now. I'm going to stop recording, but thank you so much for coming. And take a look at our conference schedule for the next set of presentations, and we'll see you online. Thanks, Chris.
Oh, thanks to all of you for spending the time with me, and I look forward to hearing your responses. Take care. Bye-bye.